I watched in absolute fury as Bradley Thornton, our HOA president, stood at the end of my private airstrip with a crew of construction workers, directing them to install a massive chain-link gate across my runway. The screech of metal on concrete echoed across my 500-acre ranch as they dragged sections of fencing into position. What Bradley didn't know, what none of these suburban trophy hunters who'd moved into my rural community understood, was that I wasn't just some weekend pilot with a hobby runway. I was Jake Morrison, former Air Force colonel, retired FAA air traffic controller, and the person who designed and managed flight approach patterns for the entire county. That airstrip they were trying to seize? It was a registered federal aviation facility with protected airspace rights dating back to 1962. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because 6 months ago, Bradley Thornton was just another city transplant I'd never heard of. It was March when the first Sunset Ridge Estates signs appeared along Highway 287, announcing a new luxury housing development adjacent to my family's century-old cattle ranch. I'd inherited the property from my grandfather, 2,100 acres of prime Texas hill country, complete with a 3,500-foot paved runway he'd built in the 60s when he started his crop dusting business. The developers, Pinnacle Communities, had been respectful during the planning phase. They'd even marketed the development as adjacent to a private aviation facility, using my airstrip as a selling point for wealthy buyers who might want to fly their own planes. What they didn't tell those buyers was that my runway wasn't just a convenience. It was a fully operational aviation facility with instrument landing systems, weather monitoring equipment, and federal protection under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulation. The first new residents started moving in during late spring. Massive houses on 5-acre lots, perfectly manicured lawns, and the kind of people who drove luxury SUVs but had never hauled anything heavier than golf clubs. They seemed nice enough at first, waving from their driveways, commenting on what a quaint operation I had. Then Bradley Thornton arrived. I first met Bradley at the inaugural Sunset Ridge Estates HOA meeting in June. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his early 50s who introduced himself as a corporate restructuring consultant from Dallas. Within minutes of the meeting starting, he'd been elected HOA president by promising to maintain property values through proactive community management. After the meeting, he approached me with a practiced smile and a business card. "Jake Morrison, right? The pilot? I'm Bradley Thornton, your new neighbor. Welcome to the area," I'd said, shaking his hand. "Hope you like it out here. It's pretty quiet most of the time." "That's exactly what we're hoping for," Bradley had replied. "Though I have to ask, that runway of yours, how often do planes use it?" "Depends. Maybe 3 or 4 flights a week. Sometimes more during cattle season when we're doing aerial surveys." Bradley's smile had tightened slightly. 3 or 4 flights a week. That's quite a bit of air traffic for a residential area. "It's been here 60 years longer than any houses," I'd pointed out. The runway was part of the original property disclosure when Pinnacle was doing their sales. Of course. Just getting familiar with the neighborhood dynamics. That should have been my first warning sign. The trouble started small, the way these things always do. In July, I found a formal letter in my mailbox from the Sunset Ridge Estates Community Standards Committee, which, as far as I could tell, was just Bradley with official letterhead. "Dear Mr. Morrison," it began, "we've received noise complaints regarding aircraft operations at your facility. While we understand this is a pre-existing use, we hope you'll consider voluntary restrictions on flight times to maintain community harmony." The letter suggested I limit flights to between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekdays only, avoiding all weekend operations. It was politely worded, but clearly designed to make my airstrip nearly useless for any practical purpose. I called Bradley directly. I got your letter about flight restrictions. You do realize this is a federal aviation facility, right? I can't just restrict operations based on HOA preferences. Oh, I'm sure we can work something out, Bradley had said smoothly. After all, we're all neighbors here. I'm certain you want to be a good community member. I've been a good community member for 37 years. The runway was here first, Bradley. Your buyers knew that when they purchased. Well, times change, Jake. Communities evolve. I'm sure you understand. The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench, but I kept my response professional. What I understand is aviation law. My runway has federal protection and grandfather rights. Your HOA has exactly zero authority over flight operations. There was a pause. We'll see about that. He hung up before I could respond. 2 weeks later, I discovered what "we'll see about that" meant. I was doing my morning pre-flight inspection on my Cessna 180 when I noticed fresh survey stakes around the perimeter of my runway. Orange spray paint marked trees, fence posts, and even sections of the runway itself. A surveyor's truck was parked on the public road, and 2 men with equipment were measuring distances and taking photographs. I walked over to them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The older surveyor looked up from his transit. "Morning. We're doing a property boundary survey for the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA. Just verifying lot lines and easements. This is private property. My private property. You're supposed to get permission before surveying someone's land." "Actually, sir, we have a court order." He pulled out a folded document. The HOA petitioned for a boundary verification survey, citing potential property encroachments and safety concerns. I snatched the paper from his hands and scanned it quickly. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. Bradley had convinced a judge that my runway might be encroaching on HOA common areas and posed a safety risk to the residential development. It was complete nonsense. My property had been surveyed multiple times, and the runway was clearly within my boundaries. But it was also clever. By framing it as a safety issue, Bradley had managed to get legal authority to investigate my operations. "This survey is based on false premises," I told them. "My property boundaries are clearly established, and this runway has federal aviation protection." The younger surveyor shrugged. "That's above our pay grade, sir. We just measure and report." I watched them work for the next 3 hours, documenting every inch of my runway, photographing my hangar, and even measuring the distance between my operations and the nearest houses. They were building a case for something, but I couldn't yet see what. That evening, I called my old friend Marcus Webb, who still worked for the FAA in Fort Worth. "Marcus, I need a favor. Can you pull the federal registration for my runway? Something weird is happening with my new HOA, and I want to make sure all my documentation is current." "Sure thing, Jake. Give me the facility identifier." I rattled off the numbers I'd memorized decades ago. There was a pause while Marcus looked it up in the system. "Okay, here we go. Morrison Ranch Airport, facility ID Tex 47. Federal registration current, instrument approach procedures active, published in sectional charts." Everything looks normal. Why? What's the problem? New neighbors think they can restrict my operations through HOA rules. Marcus laughed. "Good luck with that. You've got more federal protection than most municipal airports. Your grandfather really knew what he was doing when he registered this place." "What do you mean?" "Well, most private strips are just strips, but TX-47 is registered as a public-use airport under federal regulations. That means it's part of the National Airspace System. The FAA protects it just like we protect DFW or Austin Bergstrom." I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. "Public use airport?" "Yep, Your grandfather registered it that way in 1962 to get federal funding for the paved runway and instrument systems. Once an airport is in the federal system, it stays in the federal system. The only way to close it is through a formal FAA decommissioning process that takes years and requires proving it's not needed for public safety. This was better than I'd hoped. My runway wasn't just protected as private property, it was protected as critical aviation infrastructure. Marcus, I need you to send me every piece of documentation you have on Text 47. Registration, approach procedures, airspace protections, everything. Something tells me you're about to educate some suburban cowboys about aviation law. Something like that? 3 days later, I received a certified letter that made my blood boil. It was from a law firm in Dallas, representing the Sunset Ridge Estates, HOA. Dear Mr. Morrison, it began, our client has determined that your private runway constitutes a nuisance and safety hazard to the residential community. Recent surveys have confirmed that aircraft operations violate multiple county noise ordinances and create unacceptable risks to persons and property. The letter demanded that I voluntarily cease all aircraft operations pending a formal safety review and warned that continued use of the runway would result in legal action for maintaining a public nuisance. But here's where it got really interesting. The letter claimed that the HOA had consulted with federal aviation authorities and determined that my runway lacks proper federal registration and operates without required permits. They were lying, boldly, stupidly lying about easily verifiable federal records. I called the law firm immediately and asked to speak with the attorney who'd signed the letter, a guy named Richard Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, I'm calling about your letter regarding Morrison Ranch Airport. I think there's been some confusion about the legal status of my facility. There's no confusion, Mr. Morrison. Your client operates an illegal airstrip that poses significant risks to our community. We're prepared to seek an immediate injunction if you don't voluntarily comply. My client? I'm Jake Morrison. It's my runway. There was a pause. Oh, well, then you understand the seriousness of this situation. I understand that you've made several factual errors in your legal filing. My runway is a federally registered public-use airport with instrument approach procedures and published airspace protections. It's been in continuous operation since 1962. That's not what our research indicated. Then your research was wrong. I have complete FAA documentation proving federal registration. If you proceed with legal action based on false claims about federal aviation law, you'll be sanctioned for filing frivolous lawsuits. Another pause. I'll need to review this with my client. You do that. And while you're at it, explain to your client that attempting to close a federally protected airport without FAA approval is a federal crime. I hung up feeling satisfied, but I knew Bradley wouldn't give up easily. Men like him didn't back down just because they were wrong. They doubled down and got nastier. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and a crew of construction workers had assembled at the end of my runway. Bradley Thornton stood in the middle of it all, directing operations like a general commanding troops. I threw on clothes and ran outside. What the hell are you doing? Bradley turned to face me, no longer bothering with his practiced smile. Emergency safety measures, Jake. The HOA has determined that your runway poses an immediate hazard to community safety. We're installing protective barriers. Protective barriers? You're blocking my runway. We're protecting innocent families from an illegal aviation operation. I could see what they were building, a chain-link fence with razor wire across the entire width of my runway, effectively making it impossible for any aircraft to land or take off. This is my property. You're trespassing and destroying federal aviation infrastructure? Bradley pulled out his phone and showed me what looked like an official document. Emergency injunction, signed this morning. We have legal authority to take immediate protective action pending a full safety review. I grabbed the phone and read quickly. The injunction was real, signed by Judge Patricia Coleman in the county courthouse. But it was based entirely on the false claims from Bradley's lawyer that my runway was an unregistered, illegal operation posing immediate danger to the community. This injunction is based on lies, Bradley. My runway is federally registered and protected. Then you can prove that in court. Until then, this facility is closed for public safety. The construction crew kept working while we argued. I watched in horror as they began anchoring fence posts directly into my runway pavement, drilling holes in concrete that had been perfectly maintained for 60 years. "Stop!" I shouted at the workers. "You're destroying federal aviation property." One of the workers looked up uncertainly, but Bradley waved him on. "Keep working. We have legal authority." I pulled out my phone and called 911. "This is Jake Morrison at Morrison Ranch on Highway 287. I have trespassers destroying federal aviation infrastructure on my property." The dispatcher took my information and promised to send a deputy, but I could see the fence installation was moving fast. By the time law enforcement arrived, my runway would be completely blocked. That's when I remembered something Marcus had told me about federal aviation emergencies. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for the FAA's 24-hour emergency line. These guys handled everything from hijackings to airport security breaches. FAA Emergency Operations. This is Controller Martinez. This is Jake Morrison, former Air Force Colonel and owner of Morrison Ranch Airport, Facility ID Tex 47. I'm reporting an active federal crime in progress. Unauthorized persons are destroying a federally protected airport runway. There was immediate concern in Martinez's voice. "Sir, can you describe what's happening?" "A local HOA has obtained a fraudulent court order claiming my runway is illegal and unregistered. They have construction crews on site right now, drilling holes in my runway and installing fencing to prevent aircraft operations. Sir, I'm showing TX 47 as an active public use airport with current federal registration. Any interference with operations at that facility would be a violation of federal aviation law." "That's correct. I need immediate federal response to stop the destruction." "Stand by, sir. I'm alerting our enforcement division and contacting local FBI. Do not attempt to physically intervene with the construction crew. Federal agents will be en route within the hour." I hung up and looked back at the construction site. Bradley was supervising the installation of a massive gate right across the center of my runway. He saw me watching and smiled smugly. He had no idea what was about to hit him. 37 minutes later, I heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. A black FBI helicopter appeared over the tree line, circled the construction site once, and landed in my pasture about 100 yards from the runway. 4 federal agents in tactical gear stepped out and walked directly toward the construction site. Behind them, 2 more vehicles were approaching on the highway, unmarked sedans with federal license plates. Bradley's confident expression began to falter as he realized the magnitude of the response his little fence project had triggered. Special Agent Sarah Chen, the lead FBI investigator, walked directly up to Bradley while her team began photographing the construction equipment and interviewing workers. "Are you the person responsible for this construction project?" she asked. "I'm Bradley Thornton, president of the Sunset Ridge Estates, HOA. We have legal authority." "Sir, you're interfering with a federally protected aviation facility. I need you to order your workers to stop immediately and step away from the runway. We have a court injunction." Your court injunction is based on false information about federal aviation law. This airport has been registered with the FAA since 1962. Any interference with its operations is a federal crime. I watched Bradley's face cycle through confusion, anger, and growing panic as Agent Chen explained the legal reality of his situation. The county judge who'd signed his emergency injunction had been lied to about the federal status of my runway. Order your workers to stop now, or they'll be arrested for destruction of federal property. Bradley looked around wildly, seeing his carefully planned operation falling apart in real time. The construction foreman was already pulling his crew back from the runway, unwilling to risk federal charges for an HOA dispute. "This is insane," Bradley shouted. "It's a private runway on private property. The federal government can't." "Mr. Thornton," Agent Chen interrupted, "this is a public-use airport registered in the National Airspace System. It has the same federal protections as Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The FBI takes interference with aviation infrastructure very seriously." One of the other agents approached with a tablet showing aerial photographs of the construction site. "Man, they've drilled 17 holes in the runway pavement and installed approximately 200 feet of fencing directly across the flight path." Agent Chen nodded grimly. "Mr. Thornton, you're under arrest for destruction of federal property and interference with aviation safety." The next few minutes were surreal. I watched Bradley Thornton, the suburban power broker who'd thought he could intimidate a simple rancher, get handcuffed and placed in the back of a federal vehicle, while FBI agents documented every piece of damage his crew had inflicted on my runway. But the really satisfying part came when Agent Chen approached me with a clipboard full of forms. "Mr. Morrison, we'll need a complete assessment of damages for the federal prosecution. The FAA will also be conducting a safety investigation to determine if the runway can be returned to operational status quickly." "What happens to the HOA?" "Well, they've committed multiple federal crimes based on deliberately false information. The U.C. Attorney's Office will be filing charges against Mr. Thornton and probably the law firm that helped him file the fraudulent injunction. The HOA itself will be liable for all damages and restoration costs." "And my runway?" Agent Chen smiled. "Your runway will be restored to full operational status at the defendant's expense. The FAA doesn't mess around when it comes to protecting aviation infrastructure." As the federal agents finished their investigation and drove away with Bradley in custody, I noticed something interesting happening in the Sunset Ridge Estates development. Small groups of residents were gathering in driveways and on lawns, pointing toward my property and having animated discussions. Word was spreading fast about their HOA president being arrested by the FBI for trying to shut down a federal airport. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. FAA engineers arrived to assess runway damage. Federal prosecutors interviewed me about Bradley's harassment campaign. Local news crews showed up to report on the suburban HOA president who'd been arrested for destroying federal aviation property. But the most interesting development came on day 3, when my phone rang with a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. "Mr. Morrison? This is David Park. I'm a member of the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA board. I was wondering if we could talk." "About what?" "About making things right. Look, most of us had no idea what Bradley was planning. We're horrified by what happened, and we want to find a way to resolve this situation that works for everyone." I agreed to meet with the HOA board that evening. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and the atmosphere was completely different from Bradley's authoritarian regime. These were people who were genuinely embarrassed by their former president's actions and worried about the legal and financial consequences. David Park, who'd apparently been elected as emergency interim president, began with a formal apology. "Mr. Morrison, on behalf of the Sunset Ridge Estates community, I want to apologize for the harassment and illegal actions taken by our former president. We had no idea he was planning to physically interfere with your airport operations. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We've spoken with our lawyers, and frankly, we're looking at potentially catastrophic financial liability for the federal crimes committed in our name. The runway restoration alone is estimated at over $200,000, and that's before we get to federal fines and legal costs. I could see where this was going. The HOA was facing financial ruin because of Bradley's vendetta against me. What are you proposing? Complete withdrawal of all complaints and restrictions related to your airport operations, formal recognition of your federal aviation rights, and a community covenant that prevents future HOA boards from interfering with your operations. In exchange for... David looked uncomfortable. We're hoping you might consider not pursuing maximum damages against the HOA. A lot of innocent families could lose their homes if we're forced to pay full federal penalties. I leaned back and considered their position. These people hadn't done anything wrong except elect the wrong person to lead their community. They were now facing financial disaster because of one man's arrogance and ignorance. Here's what I'll consider, I said finally. The HOA pays for complete runway restoration and upgrades, not just fixing Bradley's damage, but bringing the entire facility up to current federal standards. That's probably $300,000. David winced, but nodded. Second, the HOA creates and funds a community aviation education program. Bring in retired pilots and air traffic controllers to teach your residents about aviation safety and the history of this airport. Make them understand that aviation was here first and isn't going anywhere. That sounds reasonable. Third, Bradley Thornton is permanently banned from any leadership role in this HOA, and the community bylaws are amended to prevent future harassment of pre-existing land uses. Done. And finally, I smiled. The HOA formally recognizes Morrison Ranch Airport as a community asset and includes it in your marketing materials as a neighborhood amenity. David looked around at the other board members, who were all nodding eagerly. Mr. Morrison, you have a deal. 6 months later, I was standing on my fully restored runway, watching a beautiful sunset over the Texas Hill Country. The new runway lighting system gleamed in the evening light, LED fixtures that were brighter and more efficient than anything the airport had ever had. The aviation education program had been a huge success. Dozens of Sunset Ridge residents had attended monthly seminars about aviation history and safety. Several had even expressed interest in learning to fly themselves. Bradley Thornton had pled guilty to federal charges and received 2 years in federal prison plus restitution payments that would continue for the next decade. His lawyer, Richard Blackwell, had been sanctioned by the state bar for filing frivolous legal actions based on deliberately false information. But the most satisfying outcome was watching the community transformation. What had started as a conflict between suburban transplants and rural aviation had become a source of neighborhood pride. The HOA had installed historical markers explaining the airport's 60-year history. They'd created a viewing area where residents could safely watch aircraft operations. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus at the FAA SAW, the news story about your HOA situation. Heard you got a brand new runway out of the deal. Nice work, Colonel. I smiled and typed back. Sometimes you have to remind people that aviation law isn't just a suggestion. As I locked up my hangar and headed back to the house, I could see lights coming on in the Sunset Ridge development. Normal families living normal lives, probably never thinking about the complex web of federal regulations that protected their rural tranquility. But tomorrow morning, when I fired up my Cessna for a flight to Austin, they'd wave from their driveways and point out the airplane to their kids. Because now they understood that Morrison Ranch Airport wasn't just some rich guy's hobby, It was a piece of aviation history that connected their community to the larger world. And if any future HOA president ever got ideas about shutting down federal aviation infrastructure, well, they'd have a much harder time finding a judge willing to sign that kind of injunction. After all, word gets around in small counties about suburban developers who mess with Air Force colonels and federal airports. I had a feeling my flying days were going to be a lot more peaceful from now on.